The mahogany felt cold and final beneath Howard Finch's liver-spotted hands. It was 3:57 a.m. in a private dining room at the Gilded Steer, a place so old and steeped in power that the leather chairs still smelled faintly of cigar smoke and 100-year-old secrets. Outside, the Chicago streets were slick with a relentless, miserable drizzle, a fitting, pathetic fallacy for the death of an empire. Howard, at 79, the patriarch of Finch Automata, a name once synonymous with American precision and craftsmanship in the world of high-end model trains, felt the tremor in his fingers not as a sign of age, but of absolute defeat. Before him, a leather-bound folio lay open. Inside, a sheaf of documents, dense with the merciless jargon of finance, awaited the stroke of his pen. Chapter 11. The words were a death sentence. He was being maneuvered, not just into bankruptcy, but into a predatory sale that would see his life's work, and his father's before him, dismantled and sold for scrap. Across the table, his grandnephew Garrett smiled. It was a perfectly calibrated expression of sympathy, but his eyes, the color of polished steel, held the glint of a wolf closing in. At 38, Garrett was all sharp angles and sharp pursuits, a product of Wharton and a philosophy that valued disruption over dedication. "It's the only way, Uncle Howard," Garrett said, his voice a smooth, reasonable balm on a gaping wound. "Obsidian Equity understands the value of the brand name. They're not just liquidators. They're revitalizers. This way, you get to retire. Keep the lake house, your dignity." Dignity. The word was a slap. What dignity was there in surrendering the company his grandfather had founded with a dream and a single lathe in 1928? Howard had weathered recessions, the rise of digital entertainment, and the hollowing out of American manufacturing. He'd survived it all. But he hadn't survived this, a cascade of perfectly timed misfortunes. A sudden spike in cobalt prices, a crippling logistics failure in Hamburg, a key patent challenge that had appeared out of nowhere. It felt less like bad luck and more like a coordinated assassination. "The liquidity covenants were breached, Mr. Finch," chirped a man named Sterling, a lawyer from a firm whose name sounded like a piece of heavy machinery. He was one of two lawyers flanking Garrett, silent sentinels billing thousands per hour to witness this execution. "The creditors are within their rights. The Section 363 sale is the most orderly path forward." Howard picked up the Mont Blanc pen, a gift from his late wife, Eleanor. Its weight felt obscene, too heavy for the simple act of signing away a century of history. He uncapped it. The nib hovered over the signature line, a tiny silver dagger aimed at his own heart. They thought the room was a sealed vacuum of power. They were aware of the tired, dark-haired waitress who had been silently refilling their water glasses for the past 2 hours, but they didn't see her. To them, she was part of the decor, a ghost in a black uniform. They were catastrophically wrong. Her name was Clara Mayhew. She was 24, and she wasn't just refilling glasses. She was observing, and in the periphery of her vision, as she leaned over to place a fresh pitcher on the table, her eyes caught a string of characters in the dense text of an appendix page, a document Garrett had carelessly left, angled towards the edge of the table. It wasn't a word she saw. It was a number, a coordinate. And Clara Mayhew, who had been forced to drop out of her cartography and geographic information systems degree program to pay for her father's debilitating medical care, knew a falsified survey marker when she saw one. Even upside down, the silence in the room was a physical pressure, the kind that precedes a building's collapse. Howard's hand, frail but resolute, began its descent. The pen nib was a millimeter from the page. "Excuse me." The voice was soft, yet it cut through the tension like a diamond drill. Garrett's head snapped up, his face a mask of irritation. "We don't need anything. Get out!" Clara stood by the table, holding an empty water pitcher like a shield. Her uniform was immaculate, but frayed at the cuffs, a testament to countless double shifts. Her dark hair was pulled back so tightly it seemed to pull at the corners of her weary eyes. She looked directly at Howard, her gaze bypassing the younger, more aggressive men. "Mr. Finch," she said, her voice steady despite the frantic hammering in her chest. "Before you sign that, sir, could I ask you a question about the old rail spur behind the main factory on the south side?" Howard blinked, startled out of his funereal trance. The question was so bizarre, so out of place, that it reset the atmosphere in the room. "The old spur? What about it?" Garrett slammed his palm flat on the table, making the crystal glasses jump. "What in God's name are you talking about? I said get out! You're fired. Do you understand me? Security." "It was decommissioned in 1978, wasn't it?" Clara pressed on, her eyes locked on Howard's. The land was part of the original deed from the city, but the survey was redrawn in the early 80s when they built the interstate exchange. The property line runs along the creek bed, not the old ballast. Howard slowly, deliberately, placed the cap back on his pen. He lowered it to the table. The old man, who had spent his life building miniature worlds with microscopic precision, understood the critical importance of a single, correctly placed line. The exhaustion in his eyes was being replaced by a flicker of something else, a shrewd, calculating curiosity he hadn't felt in years. He had spent a lifetime spotting flaws in die-cast models no bigger than his thumb. He recognized the tone of someone who saw the world in the same exacting detail. "The girl is insane, Uncle," Garrett hissed, his face flushing with anger. "She's babbling about property lines from 40 years ago. Have her removed." "Why do you ask, young lady?" Howard asked, his voice a low rumble. Clara took a small, brave step closer to the table. She could feel the heat of Garrett's fury, but she was focused on the old man. Because the legal description for the Class C asset transfer listed in Appendix B, Section 4, uses the original 1928 survey coordinates for that parcel, not the revised 1982 survey. The room fell into a silence so profound, Howard could hear the faint hum of the wine refrigerator across the room. The two lawyers exchanged a barely perceptible glance. Mr. Sterling, the lead attorney, subtly shifted his weight in his chair. "What does that mean in English?" Howard demanded, his voice sharp. Clara took a deep breath. This was it. The moment she lost everything or changed everything. "It means," she said, her voice clear and precise, "that the document you're about to sign doesn't just transfer the rights to the useless, abandoned rail spur. The old coordinate system, before the realignment, includes an extra 75 acres. It includes the land the new logistics warehouse and the primary distribution hub are built on. You're not selling a forgotten strip of dirt. You're giving away the most valuable piece of real estate the company owns, separately, to a holding company I've never heard of, before the main sale to Obsidian Equity even happens." Garrett Finch stood up so violently his chair scraped back on the polished floor. The mask of concern was gone, replaced by a rictus of pure, unadulterated rage. "You have no idea what you're talking about. You're a waitress. You read a number upside down and concocted this fantasy to try and shake us down." He pointed a trembling finger at her. "I'll have you arrested for extortion." Howard looked from his grandnephew's panicked face to the waitress's calm, certain one. He saw the sweat beading on Garrett's temple. He saw the defiant clarity in Clara's eyes. "Garrett," Howard said, his voice dangerously quiet, "show me Appendix B, Section 4. The lawyer, Sterling, began to stammer. "Mr. Finch, it's a standard boilerplate. A quitclaim transfer to clear old title encumbrances. It's procedural." "Show me," Howard repeated, the words resonating with the authority of a man who had signed paychecks for 50 years. With a shaking hand, Garrett flipped through the document. He tried to do it casually, but his fingers were clumsy. He found the page and shoved it across the table. Howard pulled a pair of reading glasses from his breast pocket and leaned over the text. He squinted, tracing the lines of legal description, the metes and bounds that were Greek to him. "I don't see it," he said, looking up at Clara. "It's just numbers." "May I, sir?" Clara asked. Before Garrett could object, Howard nodded. "Come here." Clara walked to the head of the table, standing beside the billionaire. She ignored the palpable waves of hostility from Garrett and his legal team. She leaned over, her worn cardigan brushing against the sleeve of Howard's expensive suit. She pointed a slender, unmanicured finger at a long string of characters. "There, sir. In 44.52, 5.16. W87-39-29-52. That's the center point from the old survey. The new survey point is 400 yards to the east. It's a tiny difference on paper, a single digit changed in the longitude. But on the ground, that's the difference between a gravel track and a $200 million facility." She straightened up and looked at Garrett. "The holding company it's being transferred to, Prairie Dog Holdings LLC, was registered 3 weeks ago in Delaware, wasn't it? And I'm guessing the sole managing partner is someone in this room." Garrett's face went slack. The bravado, the anger, the indignation, it all evaporated, leaving behind the stark, pale face of a man who had been caught. He didn't even try to deny it. He sank back into his chair, a defeated hiss of air escaping his lungs. Howard Finch slowly removed his glasses. He looked at his grandnephew, the boy he had paid to put through college, the young man he had mentored and trusted to be the steward of his legacy. The sense of betrayal was a physical blow, more painful than any bankruptcy. "You were stealing it," Howard whispered, the realization dawning in its full, monstrous scope. "You orchestrated this entire crisis, the cobalt prices, the shipping problems, all of it. You bled the company dry to force my hand, just so you could carve off the best piece for yourself before handing the carcass to your friends at Obsidian." Garrett finally broke. He laughed, a dry, bitter sound that held no humor. "Carve it off? I was saving it. From you. You and your nostalgic, inefficient way of doing things. You're a dinosaur, Howard. You're running a 21st century company with a 1950s mindset. I made a deal to preserve the most valuable asset. Obsidian gets the brand and the debt, I get the real estate. It was a clean solution. You were supposed to sign the paper, collect your pension, and go play with your toy trains." He gestured dismissively at Clara. "And it would have worked perfectly if it wasn't for this nobody. This little map-drawing freak who should be worrying about whether the coffee is hot." The insult was meant to sting Clara, but it had the opposite effect. It validated her. Map-drawing freak. He had seen the doodles on her notepad at the wait station, intricate, hand-drawn maps of fictional cities she created to pass the time, a habit from her abandoned studies. He'd seen it and dismissed it as the meaningless scribbling of a simpleton. He never imagined it was the mark of a skill that could unravel his entire conspiracy. "The deal is dead, Garrett," Howard said, his voice now like granite. Garrett's sneer returned. "Is it? It's 4:30 a.m. The Chapter 11 petition is set to be electronically filed with the court at 8 a.m. sharp. The motion for the 363 sale to Obsidian is attached. If you don't sign this version, the creditors file their own version, a hostile liquidation. They won't just take the company. They'll claw back every penny you've taken out for the last 5 years. They'll take the lake house. They'll take Eleanor's jewelry. They will grind you into dust." He leaned forward, his voice a venomous whisper. "My side deal might be exposed, but the fundamental problem is still there. The company is insolvent. You are cornered. You have no move. You still have to sign something by 8 a.m., or you lose everything anyway. My deal or their deal. Those are your only options. Your waitress friend here just made your last hours more interesting, but she hasn't changed the outcome." Howard's shoulders slumped. The brief surge of adrenaline drained away, leaving him cold and old. Garrett was right. The trap had been exposed, but the walls were still there. The debt was real. The deadlines were real. He was still ruined. "He's wrong," Clara said quietly. Everyone turned to her again. The lawyers looked at her as if she'd grown a second head. "Excuse me," Mr. Sterling said, his professional patience worn thin. "There is another option," Clara said, her mind racing, connecting dots she hadn't even known existed until now. She was no accountant, but her cartography training had involved poring over centuries of land grants, deeds, and corporate charters. She knew that old companies, like old maps, had hidden layers. "Mr. Finch," she said, turning to Howard. "The original factory land, the plot from 1928. How did your grandfather acquire it?" Howard frowned, the question pulling him back through decades of family lore. He didn't buy it. It was a land grant from the city of Chicago, a 999-year lease, part of a program to encourage industrial development after the Great War. We pay a nominal fee of $100 a year for it. A 999-year lease, Clara repeated, her eyes lighting up. Does that lease contain a reversionary clause? Mr. Sterling scoffed. "A what?" "Miss, this is not a history lesson." "A reversionary clause," Clara insisted, her voice gaining strength. "It's an old legal concept. It stipulates that if the land ever ceases to be used for its original chartered purpose, in this case, manufacturing and industry, then the lease terminates and the property, along with all permanent improvements thereon, reverts to the original grantor." Howard's eyes widened as he understood. "The city of Chicago." "Exactly," Clara said. "The bankruptcy you're about to file, and the subsequent sale to Obsidian Equity, a private equity firm, would extinguish the company Finch Automata as a manufacturing entity. They are financiers, not manufacturers. The moment the sale is executed, the core condition of the lease is broken." She turned to the stunned lawyers. "The logistics warehouse, the distribution hub, the main factory floor, they are all permanent improvements built on that leased land. If the sale goes through, Obsidian Equity won't be buying those buildings. They'll be buying a worthless brand name, because the physical assets will have reverted to the city of Chicago. The most valuable parts of the company aren't actually the company's to sell." A deathly pallor spread across Mr. Sterling's face. He began shuffling through the documents, his movements frantic. That's impossible. An archaic clause like that wouldn't hold up." "Wouldn't it?" Clara challenged. "The city of Chicago's legal department might be very interested to learn that they are about to become the owners of a $200 million industrial facility, free and clear. I'm sure they'd fight for it. The resulting legal battle would tie up this sale in court for a decade. Obsidian Equity's deal would be dead on arrival." Garrett just stared at her, his mouth slightly agape. He had planned for financial loopholes, for legal challenges, for his uncle's stubborn pride. He had never, in his wildest nightmares, planned for a 24-year-old waitress who knew 19th century property law. The clock on the wall ticked past 5 a.m. The trap wasn't just exposed, it was broken, but the bomb was still ticking. "So the sale is impossible," Howard said, a slow, dawning hope in his voice. The deal is off the table. But the bankruptcy isn't, Garrett snarled, recovering his composure. Fine. So my deal is dead. Obsidian's deal is dead. But the creditors are still at the gate. The company is still bleeding money. All you've done is ensure that when the clock strikes 8, the company is liquidated by a federal trustee instead of being sold. You've traded a firing squad for a hanging. Congratulations. He was right. They had leverage against the sale, but not against the underlying debt. They were no longer being forced to sell, but they were still sinking. We need to stop the filing, Howard said, his mind now sharp and clear. We need to call the creditors, explain the situation with the land lease. We can negotiate. At 5 a.m, Sterling, the lawyer, said with a cynical laugh. The petition is automated. It's queued up in the court system. It will be docketed at 8:00 a.m. unless a counter-filing is made. And to do that, you need a viable restructuring plan. You need updated financials, stakeholder agreements. You need a team of accountants and a week, not 3 hours. The flicker of hope in Howard's eyes began to dim. It was an impossible task. He was alone. His CFO had been Garrett's man, resigning 2 weeks earlier. His trusted inner circle had been systematically replaced by Garrett's people over the past year. He looked at Clara, this astonishing, unexpected girl. She had given him a shield, but he had no sword. Clara's gaze drifted to the window, where the first hints of a sickly grey dawn were beginning to silhouette the skyscrapers. She thought of her father, a former watchmaker, a man who understood intricate mechanics better than anyone. He was currently in a state-run nursing facility that smelled of bleach and despair, a place she could barely afford. If she lost this job, and she knew Garrett would make good on his threat to fire her, she wouldn't even be able to cover next month's bill. She had nothing to lose, and yet she had everything to lose. You don't need a team, Clara said, turning back to the room. Her voice was quiet, but it resonated with a newfound, steely resolve. You have the original corporate charter, don't you, Mr. Finch? The one from 1928? Howard nodded, confused. It's in the safe at the main office, a leather-bound book. Get it, Clara commanded, a sudden, startling authority in her tone. And get me a laptop with access to the company's server, and coffee. A lot of coffee. Garrett burst out laughing, a loud, derisive bray. What are you going to do? Redraw the company's charter with crayons? It's over. You can't draft a multi-million-dollar corporate restructuring plan in 2 hours. Clara turned to him, her eyes as cold and hard as river stones. I spent the last 2 years of my degree studying the historical geography of the American Midwest. That meant analyzing the legal and financial charters of every major railroad, shipping company, and industrial trust founded between 1850 and 1930. I know how these old companies were built. They weren't built on complex debt instruments. They were built on assets, land, and ironclad bylaws designed to withstand anything. She turned back to Howard, her expression softening. Your grandfather didn't build a company designed to be torn apart by vultures like him. I guarantee you, somewhere in that old leather book, there's a fail-safe, an emergency clause, a way to protect the core assets from the creditors in a crisis. She took a breath. And I'm going to find it. The Gilded Steer's private dining room transformed from a boardroom into a war room. Howard Finch, galvanized by a purpose he hadn't felt since his wife's passing, barked orders into his cell phone. A night shift security guard was dispatched to the factory office with the safe combination. A high-end laptop was requisitioned from the restaurant's manager. Garrett and his lawyers were ordered to stay put, effectively becoming prisoners of the unfolding drama. Garrett paced like a caged panther, alternating between furious, whispered calls to his own contacts, and glaring at Clara with pure hatred. Clara sat at the head of the table, Howard's laptop humming before her. The screen reflected the intense concentration on her face. When the security guard arrived, breathless with the heavy, leather-bound corporate charter, she opened it with the reverence of a scholar handling a sacred text. The pages were thick, creamy parchment, filled with elegant, curling script. "It's all here," she murmured, her fingers tracing the lines. "Bylaw, Article 7, Section 3. In the event of existential financial duress." "This is it." Howard leaned over her shoulder, his reading glasses perched on his nose. "What does it say?" "It's an emergency capitalization mechanism," Clara explained, her eyes flying across the page. "It allows the board of directors, with a majority vote from a founding family member, to issue a new class of heritage stock. This stock isn't tied to profit or equity in the traditional sense. It's tied directly to the physical, unencumbered assets listed in the original 1928 charter." "The land," Howard breathed. "The original machinery, the patents." "Exactly," Clara said, her fingers flying across the keyboard, opening financial software she hadn't touched in years, but whose logic was embedded in her brain. "This heritage stock has priority over all other forms of equity and all unsecured debt. It's a poison pill designed in the Depression era to prevent a hostile takeover by bankers. By issuing it, you create a new class of assets that is legally firewalled from the creditors. It doesn't erase the debt, but it shields the heart of the company from liquidation." "That's insane," Sterling, the lawyer, sputtered from his end of the table. "No modern court would recognize such an archaic provision. It would be challenged immediately." "Maybe," Clara countered without looking up. "But it would take months, maybe years to challenge. In the meantime, the bankruptcy petition would be stayed. It buys time. It pushes the creditors back to the negotiating table. It gives Mr. Finch leverage." "But we need a board meeting to issue the stock," Howard said, the hope draining from his face again. "Garrett has been stacking the board with his own people for a year. They'll never vote for this." Clara tapped a section of the charter. "It says the vote can be held by any 2 board members, provided one is a founding family member, in an emergency session. The quorum is 2. She looked up at Howard. "You're a board member. Who else is in this room?" Howard's eyes scanned the room. Garrett, the 2 lawyers, and him. There was no one else. Garrett let out a triumphant laugh. "Looks like you're 1 vote short, Uncle. A pity." Clara's face fell. She had found the weapon, but the firing mechanism was broken. She scrolled through the list of board members on the company's internal site, her heart sinking. Garrett's allies. All of them. Then she saw a name at the bottom of the list, under the heading Emeritus Board Members. "Eleanor Finch," Clara read aloud. Howard flinched as if he'd been struck. "My wife. She held a board seat until she passed away 3 years ago. It's a legacy title. It holds no voting power." "Are you sure?" Clara asked gently. She navigated to Eleanor's profile on the server. She scrolled down past the memorial dedication to the fine print of her board appointment documents from 1975. Her eyes widened. "Mr. Finch, according to this, your wife's seat was a lifetime appointment designated as a founding family heritage seat. It explicitly states that upon her incapacitation or death, her voting rights are not extinguished. They are to be held in trust and wielded by a designated proxy." "A proxy?" Howard asked, bewildered. "She never designated a proxy. We never talked about it." "It says here the proxy was designated in a notarized addendum dated June 10th, 2015, Clara said, pointing at the screen. She felt a knot of dread in her stomach. If Eleanor had named a proxy, surely it would have been Garrett, the grand-nephew she had doted on. Garrett's smug expression confirmed her fear. "That's right," he said, pulling a folded, notarized document from his briefcase. "Aunt Eleanor was a smart woman. She knew you'd need a steady hand to guide you when she was gone. She made me her proxy." He unfolded the paper with a flourish. "So, not only do you not have a second vote, but I now control 2 votes. The motion to issue your fantasy stock is dead. Now sign the bankruptcy papers. This little adventure is over." The air rushed out of the room. It was the final, cruelest twist of the knife. Eleanor, the woman Howard had loved more than life itself, had unwittingly handed the executioner his axe. Howard sank into a chair, his face a grey mask of grief and defeat. He looked utterly broken. Clara stared at the proxy document Garrett had tossed onto the table. It looked official. Seal, signature, notary stamp. But something was nagging at her. A tiny, dissonant detail. She thought back to her cartography work, to the hours spent authenticating historical maps. You learned to spot forgeries not by looking at what was there, but by what wasn't. The type of paper, the chemical composition of the ink, the watermark. "The date on that addendum," Clara said slowly. "June 10th, 2015. Mr. Finch, where were you and your wife on that date?" Howard looked up, his eyes hollow. I don't know." "Why? Think," Clara urged. "Was it a special day? An anniversary? A birthday?" "No, wait." A flicker of memory sparked in Howard's eyes. "June, we were in Europe, a river cruise down the Danube. For our 50th anniversary, we were in Vienna on June 10th. I remember because we went to the opera to see The Magic Flute." Clara's gaze sharpened. She stood up and walked around the table, picking up the proxy document. "The notary public is listed as one Charles J. Webb, Cook County, Illinois." She looked directly at Garrett, her eyes like ice chips. "How did your Aunt Eleanor sign a document in front of an Illinois notary when she was on a boat in Austria?" Garrett's face, which had been a portrait of smug victory, crumbled. He lunged for the paper, but Clara was quicker. She held it up. "This is a forgery," she declared, her voice ringing with certainty. "A clumsy one at that." "Prove it," Garrett spat, his voice cracking. "I don't have to," a new voice said from the doorway. Everyone turned. Standing there was Joe, the night shift security guard, the one who had fetched the charter. But he wasn't alone. Beside him stood a grim-faced woman in a sharp suit, holding a small digital recorder. "My apologies for the interruption, Mr. Finch," Joe said, nodding at Howard. "But when you called about the charter, you sounded distressed. And when this gentleman," he gestured at Garrett, "made his own calls, he was talking about overriding security protocols. So I took the liberty of activating the room's archival recording system. Standard corporate security protocol for sensitive meetings." He looked at the woman beside him. "This is Ms. Albright, from our Internal Audit and Compliance Department. She's been listening in for the last hour." Ms. Albright stepped forward. "Mr. Garrett Finch, your attempt to defraud the company via a falsified land transfer, coupled with this fraudulent proxy document, constitutes multiple felonies. We have it all on tape." She looked at Howard. "Sir, as for the second board vote you require, I believe I can help." She tapped her tablet, and a document appeared on the large screen on the wall. While Eleanor Finch's proxy is a forgery, she did have a living will and trust, which I have just pulled from our records. In it, she designated a successor trustee for her corporate affairs, in the event her primary proxy was found to be unsuitable. "Who?" Howard asked, his voice trembling. a man she described as having unimpeachable integrity and a deep love for the Finch legacy, Miss Albright read. Your head of security, Mr. Joseph O'Malley. Joe, the security guard, who had worked for the company for 35 years, looked as stunned as anyone. He took off his cap, running a hand through his thinning grey hair. Me? Mrs. Finch. She trusted you, Joe, Howard said, a real, genuine smile finally breaking through the despair on his face. She always said you were the most honest man she ever knew. He stood up, his back straight and proud. Mr. O'Malley, as a voting member of this board, I call an emergency session to order. I move that we issue heritage stock, per Article 7, Section 3 of the Corporate Charter, to protect this company from hostile action. Do I have a second? Joe straightened his tie. He looked at Garrett, who was being flanked by 2 more security guards who had appeared behind Miss Albright. Then he looked at Howard and at Clara, the young woman who had started it all. Aye, Joe said, his voice thick with emotion. The motion passes. The clock on the wall read 7:15 a.m. The hours that followed were a blur of controlled chaos. With the immediate threat of bankruptcy neutralized by the board vote, the dynamic in the room shifted entirely. Garrett Finch was escorted out by security, not to a police car just yet, but to a vacant office down the hall where he would be held until Howard Deck. The silence that descended in the wake of Garrett's departure was heavier than the one that had preceded it. It was not a silence of tension, but of sheer, cavernous exhaustion. The adrenaline that had coursed through Howard Finch's ancient veins for the last 3 hours evaporated, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness and the bitter, metallic taste of betrayal. He sank into his chair at the head of the table, the mahogany no longer feeling cold and final, but merely old. Like him. Garrett's parting words, delivered in a venomous whisper to him alone as security led him away, echoed in the stillness. You think you've won? You just handed the keys to a ghost. She doesn't know the territory. She'll get you lost in your own backyard. Across the table, Clara Mayhew stood motionless, her hand still resting on the back of a chair. The first, weak light of a Chicago dawn filtered through the tall windows, painting the room in shades of grey and silver. The light caught the frayed cuffs of her uniform and the profound weariness in her eyes. She looked less like a corporate savior and more like a soldier after a long and brutal siege, unsure if the silence meant victory or just a temporary lull in the fighting. The 2 remaining lawyers from Garrett's team were huddled in a corner, speaking in frantic, hushed tones into their phones, their professional masks shattered, revealing the naked panic of men whose billable hours had just collided with accessory to fraud charges. Ms. Albright, the compliance officer, was methodically packing documents into a briefcase, her movements precise and devoid of emotion, a study in corporate control. Howard cleared his throat. The sound was a dry rasp. Ms. Mayhew, he began, the name feeling formal and inadequate on his tongue. He paused, searching for the right words. Thank you? You saved my life's work? Nothing seemed to fit the scale of what had just transpired. She finally looked at him, her gaze direct, unreadable. He was right about one thing, Mr. Finch. Howard frowned. Garrett, what are you talking about? The company is still insolvent, she said, her voice flat with exhaustion. The heritage stock issuance, it's a brilliant legal shield from a bygone era. It's a fortress wall, but the garrison inside is still starving. We've stopped the execution, but the disease is still raging. The creditors won't just go away. They'll lay siege. She wasn't celebrating. She wasn't asking for a reward. She was already analyzing the next phase of the war. In that moment, Howard understood Garrett's final, bitter warning. She doesn't know the territory. He was wrong. She was the only one in the room who understood that the map and the territory were two different things. For a year, he and his board had been staring at Garrett's maps, spreadsheets, profit and loss statements, liquidity reports. They were elegant, convincing fictions. Clara had just walked the actual ground. "Come with me," Howard said, pushing himself to his feet. His knees protested, but his voice held a renewed, if fragile, authority. Clara blinked. "Sir? Where are we going?" "To the factory," he said. "To the territory." The drive to the south side was surreal. Howard's driver, a man named Marcus, who had been with him for 30 years, navigated the awakening city streets with a stoic silence, his eyes in the rearview mirror, betraying a deep concern for the old man in the back. Howard and Clara sat in the cavernous leather interior of the Rolls-Royce, a chasm of social class between them. Clara seemed to shrink into the plush seat, her server's uniform looking starkly out of place. She stared out the window at the landscape of brick and steel, her expression not one of awe, but of intense, analytical observation. She was reading the city, tracing the flow of traffic, noting the position of rail lines and warehouses. When they arrived, the factory was a hulking silhouette against the bruised purple sky. The morning shift was just beginning, men and women in worn boots and company jackets streaming through the gates, their faces etched with the uncertainty that had plagued the company for months. They nodded at Howard's car with a mixture of respect and apprehension. Howard led Clara not to the executive offices, but through a side door and directly onto the main assembly floor. The air was thick with the smell of cutting oil, hot metal, and something else. The smell of history. The roar of machinery was a physical force, a symphony of lathes, presses, and CNC machines that Howard had known his entire life. To him, it was the sound of his family's heart beating. He watched Clara. She didn't flinch from the noise. Instead, she stood for a long moment, her head tilted, listening. Her eyes swept the vast space, not as a tourist, but as a surveyor. She wasn't looking at the machines. She was looking at the spaces between the machines. She was watching the flow of people and parts, the intricate, chaotic ballet of production. "Your grandfather laid this floor out in 1946, after the war," Howard said, his voice raised over the din. "It was state-of-the-art, a perfect linear progression." Clara walked slowly down the main artery of the factory. She stopped and pointed. "That press," she said, indicating a massive German stamping machine. "It produces the chassis for the 442 locomotive model. The raw steel comes from the loading bay over there, on the west side." She pointed across the floor. "Then the finished chassis has to be transported all the way over there, to the east side, for the initial component assembly. That's a 300-yard journey, crossing 2 other production lines, and a primary forklift route." She looked at him. "Why?" Howard frowned. "That's where the assembly station has always been." "The press was installed in 2008, wasn't it?" she asked. "It replaced a smaller, older model." "Yes, it was our last major capital improvement," Howard admitted. "You put the new machine where the old one was," Clara stated, not as a question, but as a conclusion. "But the new machine is twice as efficient. It creates a bottleneck downstream. The chassis pile up here, waiting for transport. The forklift operators have to make a hazardous crossing. The assembly team over there has dead time, waiting for parts. You're not running a linear progression anymore. You're running a dozen tangled streams that all lead to a logjam." She had been on his factory floor for less than 5 minutes and had diagnosed a fundamental inefficiency that his entire management team, with their MBAs and 6 Sigma certifications, had missed for over a decade. They read the reports. She read the room. They spent the next 4 hours walking the territory, from the cavernous, poorly organized logistics warehouse to the dusty, forgotten archives in the basement. In the archives, surrounded by shelves of decaying cardboard boxes, Clara found what she was looking for: the original survey maps and blueprints for the entire Finch industrial complex, dating back to 1928. She unrolled a massive, linen-backed blueprint on a long table, its surface cracked with age. It depicted the original factory, the rail spur, and the vast tracts of land around it. "Here," she said, her finger tracing a faint, dotted line. "This is a ghost." "A ghost?" Howard asked, leaning in. "An old service tunnel. It connects the basement of this building to the foundation of the logistics warehouse. It was used to run steam pipes from the main boiler in the 1930s. It was sealed off in the 60s. She looked up at him, her eyes bright with an idea. "It's still there. We could install a modern conveyor system through it. It runs directly underneath the main factory floor. We could use it to move parts from the presses to the assembly stations without ever touching the main floor. You wouldn't just clear the log jam, you'd eliminate forklift traffic from the most congested areas entirely. It would increase safety and boost efficiency by, 15, 20%. Howard stared at the blueprint, then at Clara. He felt a dizzying sense of vertigo, as if the ground beneath his feet had shifted. He had spent 79 years walking this territory, and this 24-year-old woman, in a single morning, had revealed a hidden geography he never knew existed. She had found a ghost in his machine. They returned to the executive wing as the sun reached its zenith. The offices were a museum of mid-century corporate grandeur, dark wood paneling, thick carpets, and oil paintings of Howard's father and grandfather. It felt like a tomb. In his own office, a corner suite with a panoramic view of the factory and the city beyond, Howard finally gestured for Clara to sit. He remained standing, looking out the window. "My wife, Eleanor, she loved this view," he said quietly. "She said it was a portrait of ambition, of something built to last." He turned to face Clara. "I almost signed it all away for the price of my dignity." "What a fool." "You were grieving, sir," Clara said softly. "Not just for your company, for an idea of the world you thought was gone." "And you?" he asked. "What do you believe in, Clara Mayhew?" She took a moment, gathering her thoughts. "I believe the world is a complex place. People try to simplify it, to turn it into a list of numbers or a set of directions. But they miss the details. They miss the topography. I believe that if you look closely enough at any map, you can find a better way to get where you need to go. And sometimes you find paths you never knew were there." Howard walked to his massive mahogany desk. He opened a drawer and pulled out a checkbook. He wrote a check and pushed it across the polished surface towards her. Clara looked down at it. The amount was staggering. It was enough to pay for her father's care for a decade, to buy a house, to finish her degree, and 10 others. It was, "Go away and live a comfortable life" money. She slid it back across the desk. "Thank you, Mr. Finch. But this is a payment. It ends our transaction," she said, her voice steady. "I don't want a payment. I want to help you redraw the map." Howard stared at her, a slow, genuine smile spreading across his weary face. It was the first time he had truly smiled in months. "The position of Chief Strategy Officer comes with a considerable salary, Ms. Mayhew, and a budget. It is not a payment. It is an investment." Clara's composure finally cracked. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. "Mr. Finch, I'm a waitress. I don't have a degree. The people here, they won't listen to me." "You won't be a waitress," he said, his voice firm. You will be an officer of this company. As for your degree, we will pay for you to complete it at any university you choose. And as for my people, they will listen to me, and I will be listening to you." He leaned forward, his eyes locking with hers. I spent the last 20 years trying to find a successor in my own image. I was looking for a reflection. I should have been looking for a new pair of eyes. The first 6 months were a brutal, grinding war fought on 2 fronts. Externally, Obsidian Equity and the spurned creditors, egged on by a vengeful Garrett Finch, now out on bail and awaiting trial, launched a coordinated assault. They filed nuisance lawsuits, planted negative stories in the financial press, and leaned on suppliers to tighten credit terms. They sought to create a narrative that Finch Automata was being run by a senile patriarch and his unqualified, manipulative protégé. But the real war was fought inside the factory walls. Clara's appointment was met with a wall of silent, stubborn resistance. The old guard, the division managers and senior engineers who had worked at Finch for decades, saw her as an affront. They called her Howard's Folly in the break rooms. They slow-walked her requests, answered her questions with condescending simplicity, and presented her with intractable problems they claimed had no solution. Clara never raised her voice. She never pulled rank. Instead, she walked the territory. She spent 12 hours a day on the factory floor, in the warehouses, in the design labs. She learned the name of every machinist on the night shift. She brought coffee to the logistics team at 5 a.m. She didn't give orders. She asked questions. Why does this part have to be milled this way? What if we shifted this workflow by 10 feet? Can you show me how this machine works? Her breakthrough came with a man named Frank Belasco, the head of tooling and die-making, a 50-year veteran with hands like leather mallets and a disposition to match. He was the heart of the old guard's resistance. For weeks, he treated Clara with undisguised contempt. One afternoon, she found him staring at a complex schematic for a new die, a curse rumbling in his chest. "The tolerances are impossible," he grumbled, more to himself than to her. "The metal will warp during the cooling phase. Garrett's Ivy League design boys want miracles." Clara stood beside him, studying the drawing. "What if you're looking at the problem from the wrong angle?" she asked quietly. "And what would you know about it, sweetheart?" he sneered. Instead of reacting, she picked up a pencil. "You're planning the cooling channels in a standard parallel grid. That creates uneven heat distribution. It's like a weather map. You're creating a high-pressure zone here and a low-pressure zone here. The warp is inevitable." With a few deft strokes, she sketched a new pattern on a notepad, not a grid, but a spiraling, fractal design, like the veins of a leaf. This distributes the cooling fluid evenly from the center outwards. It follows the natural thermal gradient of the material. No pressure zones, no warping. Frank stared at her sketch. He looked at his own complex multi-million-dollar KD model on the screen. Then he looked back at her simple, elegant drawing on a piece of scrap paper. A slow, grudging respect dawned in his eyes. "Where in God's name did you learn that?" "Fluid dynamics was a required course for my degree," Clara said with a small smile. "You have to understand how water shapes a landscape. It's not so different from how heat shapes steel." From that day on, Frank Belasco became her staunchest ally, and where Frank went, the rest of the old guard followed. The resistance crumbled, replaced by a cautious curiosity, then by an enthusiastic collaboration. 1 year to the day after that night at the Gilded Steer, Finch Automata held a company-wide meeting in the main warehouse. The space had been transformed. Clara's redesigned workflow was in full effect. The floor was clean, the pathways clear. The old sealed tunnel now housed a gleaming new conveyor system that hummed quietly beneath their feet, the factory's new secret heartbeat. Howard Finch stood on a makeshift stage. He looked 10 years younger. He announced that the company had just posted its first profitable quarter in 3 years. The lawsuits had been dismissed. A new line of credit had been secured from a local Chicago bank. The room erupted in cheers. He held up a hand for silence, his eyes finding Clara, who was standing not at the front, but in the middle of the crowd with Frank and his team. "A year ago," Howard said, his voice resonating with emotion, "I looked at this company, and I saw an ending. I saw a legacy turning to dust. I was wrong. I was looking at an old map, and I had forgotten that the territory can change, that you can always draw new lines." He raised a glass. "I want to toast the woman who gave us a new map, who taught us that our greatest assets aren't our machines or our patents, but our ingenuity, our history, and the ghosts in our foundation. To our Chief Operating Officer, Clara Mayhew." The title was new. He hadn't told her yet. Clara's eyes went wide as the entire workforce turned to her, their applause thunderous and genuine. Later that evening, Clara sat in her new office, Howard's old corner suite. He had insisted, moving himself to a smaller office next door. "A good cartographer needs the best view," he'd said. Her desk was covered not with spreadsheets, but with maps, logistics networks, workflow schematics, and demographic analyses for new markets. Her phone rang. It was her father. He was at a private care facility on the North Shore, a beautiful place with gardens overlooking the lake. His voice was strong, clear. "Clarabelle," he said, the old nickname warming her heart. "I saw the news on the business channel. Your picture was on the screen." "It's been a crazy day, Dad," she said, smiling. "They called you a visionary," he said, a note of profound pride in his voice. "I told my nurse, that's my daughter. She always could see the hidden patterns. You remember when you were a little girl, you'd take apart my old clocks? You weren't interested in the hands. You were fascinated by the gears, the way they all fit together. You were always a map maker. I learned from the best, Dad," she said, her throat tightening. "A master watchmaker." "It's all the same, kiddo," he said. "A watch, a factory, a city. They're all just complex systems. The trick is finding the mainspring, the part that gives everything else its power." He paused. "You found the mainspring, Clara. You wound it back up." After she hung up, Clara walked to the great window. She looked down at the factory, blazing with light under the vast starry sky. It was no longer just a collection of buildings. It was a living organism, its arteries flowing smoothly, its heart beating strong and steady. Garrett had been wrong. She hadn't gotten them lost. She had simply shown them that the oldest, most forgotten paths on the map sometimes led directly to the future. She wasn't a ghost haunting the territory. She was its cartographer. And her work had just begun.